Hello and welcome to our next lesson. What we're going to discuss today is a theory in political philosophy by John Rawls. And we can think of political philosophy as being a subset of ethics, where political philosophy is concerned with questions such as what is the proper form of government and what kinds of principles of justice should a government have. In other words, how should government ought to be. And one question in particular in political philosophy is in regards to providing a theory of distributive justice. What a theory of distributive justice provides is, well, it discusses how the government ought to distribute goods, rights, burdens, and wealth. How to distribute resources such as goods, for example, tax dollars. How should the government use its tax dollars? Should we use some to fund a military, some for a welfare state to help those who are in need, or should we have some set aside for emergency relief just in case there's natural disasters? How should we distribute these resources? Also, distributive justice is concerned with how we distribute rights. Should we give equal rights to everyone? Should we let some people in certain groups have more rights than other people in different groups? Or not? What are the burdens? For example, what kinds of obligations do people have towards others within their society? And it's also, you can think of it as a distribution of wealth. This is financial wealth, such as, once again, in regards to things like tax dollars. John Rawls offers a theory of distributive justice, and his theory can be classified one as being a social contract theory. There can be a variety of different kinds of political philosophies that fall within the general umbrella of a social contract theory. Generally, a social contract theory is being used for deriving the principles of justice. What kinds of principles should a government espouse or endorse? And we can think of a social contract as a procedural kind of justice that leads to fairness. The idea here is that there is some kind of procedure, and if we follow this procedure, what comes out of the procedure is what the principles of justice are. And the idea with a social contract theory is that people get together. Imagine that people come together to form a social contract where they will try to reach a general consensus of what they will generally agree upon as being the principles of justice, and they will kind of consent or agree to this contract. And usually there are rational constraints put on what a theory of social contract theory must have in order to properly derive the principles of justice. As we're going to discuss with Rawls, there is a rational constraint, as we're going to see, in that whatever principles of justice come out of a social contract, that must itself be come out of the veil of ignorance, as we're going to see. And with a social contract theory, there's this notion of autonomy, that parties actively take part in making principles that form the contract. So the idea here is that you can think of autonomy as being like the freedom or free will to make your own decisions. And the idea here is that people get together and they discuss and they debate and they talk about what principles of justice their society should have in this kind of hypothetical scenario. And they actively take part in making the principles that form the contract. So you can imagine it as being kind of a hypothetical scenario if people were to get together to form the principles of justice, and there are these certain rational constraints that they must abide by when coming up with the principles of justice, then whatever comes out of this procedure are the justified principles of justice. Okay, so Rawls has this mechanism within his procedure, within his social contract procedure, called the original position. So if a principle of justice is justified on his view, it must be derived from the original position. And what is the original position? We can think of the original position as being when one is behind a veil of ignorance. So the idea here is that you can imagine when you're in the original position that you are veiled. There's a veil before your eyes, so to speak, such that you cannot see past the veil. In other words, you're ignorant of what's past the veil. And in this respect, you're ignorant of what kind of socioeconomic status you're born into, for example, whether you're born into a poor family, rich family, middle class, what your natural assets are going to be. Are you going to be born with a very high ceiling threshold of intelligence, or just moderate, or maybe you're not going to be very smart, or maybe you're born as severely mentally handicapped, or perhaps you're born with hip dysplasia and you can't walk, or maybe you're born normal, or maybe you're born where, given your God-given talents, you could be an Olympian or a professional athlete if you work hard. Right? So you don't know what your natural assets are going to be when you're born. You don't know what religion you're going to believe in, or usually what religion people believe depends upon what family they happen to be born into. So you don't know what religion you're going to believe, what family you're going to be born into. You don't know your sex, whether you're going to be male or female. You don't know things like your race, right? Whether you're going to be black or white, what have you. So the idea here is that behind the veil of ignorance, and why when forming the social contract, why one must be behind a veil of ignorance, is to try to create principles of justice that are fair, that are not based on factors that are largely beyond our control. Right? When we're born, we're kind of thrown into the world with certain kinds of characteristics and attributes that are not part of our doing, such as being born into a very poor family where one will have significantly many more burdens and more obstacles to overcome for success as compared to, on average, if you're born into a wealthy family or even middle class family. You're not sure, for example, whether you're born with physical or mental disabilities or not. You're not sure what religion you're going to be. You don't have any control over whether you're born male or female, or your race. So the idea here is to try to eliminate factors that should not be morally relevant for making discriminations in regards to the principles of justice. So given Rawls' social contract theory, we should imagine us getting together to form our social contract of what kinds of principles our government should endorse. And in so doing, we should imagine that all of us are behind the veil of ignorance, where none of us know these various qualities about ourselves, what we're going to be born into, so to speak. And then, behind this veil of ignorance, imagine us trying to come up with principles of justice. What kinds of principles would we agree to? Would we agree to having principles of justice where maybe people in certain groups, maybe people of certain religious groups, or people of certain races do not have equal rights as compared to people of other religious groups or of other races or even sex? And the idea here is that no, we would not agree to those things because we are not sure if we might be born into those families or gender or race or what have you ourselves. That could be us. So we're not going to agree or assent to principles of justice that would make these kinds of discriminations. So this leads us to what the two principles of justice. So Rawls claims that from his original position and his social contract theory, there would be two main principles of justice that would be derived from this kind of procedure. The first one is that there's an equal right to basic liberties. This entails a right to vote, run for office, freedom of speech and assembly, freedom of thought, the right to own property. So everyone has equal rights to basic liberties and basic freedoms like the freedom of speech. We will not make discriminating judgments based on gender or socioeconomic class, or if someone is born maybe with a missing limb, we won't say, okay, you have less rights because you were born this way as compared to someone else. Or if you have a different religion, we wouldn't say, okay, we're going to discriminate against this religious group rather than another. These are things that we would agree to, once again, because we're behind the veil of ignorance. And we're not sure if that might be us, right? We might be born into that group. So the second principle of justice can be broken up into two parts, a 2A and a 2B. 2A says this: an unequal distribution is allowed if it's to the advantage of the least off. So the first principle says that everyone has an equal right to basic liberties. But the second principle says, well, sometimes there can be an unequal distribution. There can be an unequal distribution of wealth, of money, such as income, or maybe tax dollars, or even rights, if it's to the advantage of the least off. In other words, if it benefits the least off, then an unequal distribution of goods, wealth, rights, etc. is allowed. So we can look at one particular case. So if we look, let's say, within a business, and let's say there's a corporate ladder where there are people at various levels and different pay grades. For example, there's a CEO at the very top making the most amount of money. Then you have people like the president and the vice president, so on and so forth, middle management, and then the blue-collar workers within that same company. And there's an unequal distribution of income. Rawls says that this unequal distribution is allowed. And why would he say that this is allowed? Well, he says this is allowed because it's to the advantage of the least off. It's to the benefit of the least off. How might this be a benefit to the least off, that people are paid differently within this one company? For example, the CEO might be making a lot more money, or most likely would be making a lot more money than the blue-collar worker. Well, Rawls says this is to the advantage of the least off because it provides incentives. Differences in pay provides incentives for people to work hard and try to better themselves, and let's say know more about business such that one can make better business decisions. And insofar as this provides the right kinds of incentives, people work hard, they get smarter, more knowledgeable, then you have more competition. And then you have are CEOs who are generally more intelligent because of this kind of incentive to better themselves and to work hard to be a CEO and get that extra pay. And so on average, you would have better decision makers up at the top, such that that one business is more likely to survive, such that the blue collar workers, in other words, the least off, have a job. And it could be the case, without having the incentives, that the CEO is someone who is not as talented, doesn't have as much merit as compared to if there were incentives that would motivate people to work hard and become better at their jobs. In which case, if you don't have a good CEO, the business will fall under, and the blue-collar workers then will not even have a job. So it would be to the advantage for the blue-collar workers to have a job and maintain their job. And this, in significant part, requires having a CEO who's making good, wise decisions for the company. And that likelihood of having such a CEO increases when there is an unequal distribution in income, where the CEO will make more money than the blue-collar worker. All right, so that's Rawls's justification for why there's an unequal distribution is allowed. The 2B aspect, or the second aspect of the second principle of justice, is that there is an equal opportunity to jobs. And we can imagine being behind the veil of ignorance, we would not have discrimination, right, based on things like socioeconomic class or gender or race, based on being hired for a job, because we're not sure if when we're actually born into the world, whether or not we might be part of that class or group that is being discriminated against. And Rawls says the main principle of these two that is most important and carries the greatest weight is the first principle. Okay, so here are some possible objections. So one thing Rawls allows for in his political system is that there are things like a welfare state. For example, if we're behind the veil of ignorance, would we allow for it to be the case that, let's say someone is born with hip dysplasia and they cannot walk, and let's say they're born into a poor family where their family cannot afford to have this surgery for this infant or this child, would we have a system that would allow for, let's say, some tax dollars going to help this person for this surgery? And Rawls would say yes, because we're not sure ourselves when we're behind the veil of ignorance whether or not we would allow for or whether or not we ourselves might be born with hip dysplasia. And in our country, we do have something like this where we help out those children who are born with these kinds of physical abnormalities. And there's also further aspects of a welfare system, or just generally a system that helps other people within our country who are in need. For example, people who have lost their jobs or are unemployed looking for employment. There's a welfare system for them to provide them temporary relief. There's also systems such as when there are natural disasters, people lose their houses and their basic things that they need to survive, such as having shelter. There is some governmental assistance in those regards, and some tax dollars are used to help those families out. So Rawls would say we would allow for that because we're not sure ourselves whether or not, for example, that might happen in our lives, right? When we're hit with a natural disaster, let's say we have a family and we have mouths to feed, roof to put over people's heads, and now we've lost a lot of that, well then that could happen to us. So we should have a system in government where we help each other out and we help other people. However, there could be possible problems, right? So you could have, for example, loopholes in the welfare system where some people might abuse the system. So this is an objection against Rawls. One way Rawls could respond to this is that you try to cut off the loopholes, right, as best as you can. Second objection, someone might say this: well, shouldn't CEOs be able to make as much as the market will pay them? So Rawls will say that CEOs should get paid more than those in the least off group, such as the blue-collar workers within the same company. However, they cannot be paid too much more. So we have CEOs right now who, for example, are making over $100 million per year. Then the next year they make over $100 million, so on and so forth. Meanwhile, within that company, you can have blue-collar workers who are making minimum wage. Rawls would say that CEOs should get paid more in order to provide incentives, but he would say once enough incentives, financial incentives, are in place, people should not get paid more than that. The CEO should not get paid more, and rather that money should be redistributed amongst those who are least off and middle management as well. So for example, Rawls might say, well, to provide enough incentives for people to work hard and excel to be a CEO, he might say all you need to do is pay them maybe, let's say, $10 million per year. Then, if they were making $100 million per year, you should take that extra $90 million and redistribute it amongst the workers. Give some to middle management, give some to the lower blue-collar workers. And that would be to the advantage of the least off, right? Remember his principle 2A. So Rawls would put a cap at how much a CEO could make. Kind of like a salary cap in professional basketball, and there are other places where they have salary caps. Rawls would put on a salary cap for CEOs because it would be to the advantage of the least off. However, someone might object, well, why can't the CEO make as much as the market will pay them? Right? Didn't they earn it, for example? So that's an objection that we'll look more closely at in regards and when we discuss Nozick's political philosophy. Okay, so that's it for this lesson on Rawls, and I'll see you for the next lesson.